So thanks, everyone. I came here after listening to Norm speak a little bit about infrastructure and grid investment. And one of the comments made was really the fact that extra high voltage and large power transformers weren't available domestically. And that was one of the items that, as we looked at job creations, that there would be a little bit of lag time in bringing up that manufacturing capability. So I stayed after on the call and kind of piped in on the frequently asked questions segment and said, maybe the facts aren't quite right. So, if we go back 20, 30, 40 years, we had very large investments in the grid. We saw those kind of wrap up in the 70s and 80s. And we saw all of the large power transformer manufacturing facilities in North America, close down through the 80s and 90s to the point that no high voltage of 500 or 765 kV volt transformer was manufactured in the US from roughly 1999 until roughly 2015. But the facts that are lost to a lot of people are the fact is that there were 4 large facilities built from 2010 to 2013. And so we have all of the capabilities now in North America to provide what is probably the most expensive item in a transmission line. And so the industry is alive and well, and the capability is critical to keep within the United States, as we look at grid reliability and how long it takes to replace one of those units, which can take about a year to manufacture in total. So as we look at the different facilities, really the issue gets here as to how large a facility or how large a transformer you can build and what voltage class transformer you can build. And so there is a very good presence of manufacturing capability here, and we want to make sure that that's still there. But we still suffer with really getting an uptake of the purchase, both from federally funded entities as well as the investor-owned utilities in buying American products. So still 70 to 80% of the largest and highest voltage transformers are imported between South Korea, are imported into the U.S. So as we look at the imports in general, none of the U.S. manufacturing facilities ship to any of these countries. However, as we say, still 70 to 80% of the large power transformers come in. If we put any sort of emphasis on Buy American and really getting to equality in trade, we would probably create 4,000 to 5,000 U.S. jobs in the transformer industry alone and our suppliers. And as you look at kind of the supply base of a transformer, this is our supply base as I look out of Waukesha, Wisconsin, where we buy our different products. It scatters around and really brings forward a lot of job creation, in our case, across the eastern United States, in the case of our competitors, across other cross-sections as well. Then a little bit about us. We're probably the largest, sole transformer manufacturer in the U.S. We have a very large facility in Waukesha, Wisconsin, and then a fairly large medium power facility in Goldsboro, North Carolina. And we make, if you look on the right, you can see a gentleman standing there, and that's probably one of the smaller end of the transformers we build in the large power facility that we have in Waukesha.
I can talk a little bit about
Sure. Go ahead.
Trade Point Atlantic.
Right.
Just to give you a quick thumbnail sketch of the project, Trade Point Atlantic is the former Bethlehem Steel Mill site in Sparrows Point, Maryland, just outside of Baltimore. It's a 3,100-acre site that has some great assets: deep-water marine terminal, about 100 miles of rail on the site, an operating Class 3 short line railroad, connections to CSX and Norfolk Southern, interstate highway running through the middle of it, and then the 3,100 acres of industrially zoned land in a major urban center on the East Coast. So a pretty amazing property with a lot of potential to be redeveloped into a manufacturing, distribution, and logistics hub. It certainly has its challenges. Not surprisingly, environmental is a big piece. I talked about that a lot in our last session, and we have a good solution in place, both a legal, engineering, and financial model that I think will get us to a good environmental outcome. But on the job side, the real story of our project is job creation, economic development. And I sit before you as somebody who had family that worked at the steel mill. My wife had family that worked at the steel mill. We're relatively successful professionals today, and we owe that to people that went to work in some very dangerous jobs a long time ago to get us where we are. But and at its peak, the mill employed 30,000 people in 1957. It was the economic powerhouse in Baltimore, with the Glenn L. Martin Company building bombers up the road, running a close second. But today, over the last 15 years, we've had the bankruptcy of Bethlehem Steel, followed by 5 successive owners that couldn't run the property profitably. And when the mill finally ceased operations in 2012, there were about 1,200 people working there, so down from a peak of 30,000. And so the question is, what do we do for this community? And when I say community, there's a very tight-knit community around the mill, mostly people that work there. But then really, I think of it in terms of the city and the region. Baltimore is certainly a city that's had its issues. I mean, I assume all of you have access to CNN and probably saw what happened 2 years ago. Really unfortunate, the riots that occurred in Baltimore. I think they really sent the wrong message about the potential the city has. And so the other problem we have is that over the last few decades, the focus in our region has really been on what we say are the feds, meds, and eds. We've put our money into biotechnology, we've put our money into cybersecurity, and it's been great for Maryland. We're fortunate to be a half hour up the road from DC. But the real question is, for the person that graduates from high school in Baltimore and doesn't want to go in the military and doesn't want to go to college, where do they go? And today, we don't have great answers for that, other than I'd like to think that Trade Point Atlantic will be the answer. So what we're trying to do, as I said before, is create a manufacturing, distribution, and logistics hub, where we create the kind of middle skill jobs that allow people that don't want to be in the military and don't want to go to college to be able to sustain families the way that employees of the mill did in recent decades, so that the people that come to work at TPA today can do the same things that my uncle and my wife's grandfather did, that enable people like me to sit up here in front of you. So when we think about bringing that back to infrastructure, then, I mean, there's obviously the basic infrastructure need of how do we get this site working? How do we deal with that and those environmental problems? How do we deal with really decades of deferred maintenance on the infrastructure on the site that makes it a very tough place to build and do business? But there's a broader infrastructure issue, and I'll tell you that when prospective customers come to us and they talk about building their facility at Trade Point Atlantic, the first thing they want to talk about is logistics. That's their biggest cost. So they want to know how are they going to use our railroad, our marine terminal, our highway access, to make their supply chain more efficient. The next thing they want to talk about is what's the workforce look like in Baltimore. Then they want to talk about transit. So if you've got the workforce, how are you going to get them here? So this job creation strategy that we've got, it really hinges on these bigger public investments in things like recreating efficient transit links to get people from the entire region to the jobs down here, making the investment in things like workforce development programs, so that the employers that come to our site come to a trained workforce, not having to do the training themselves. I mean, I'm optimistic about this because I think that the state of Maryland and Baltimore County, Baltimore City are all collectively understand exactly what I just said to you, and we're making the investments. The Maryland General Assembly this year just passed just 2 months ago, passed a sweeping manufacturing incentive bill that I think is really going to create some tax relief. It's going to lure manufacturers to the state. But behind the scenes, we're working on transit, we're working on workforce development, and utility infrastructure. How do we get power, and how do we get gas and water to the site? These are all the things that are going to facilitate 21st century clean manufacturing. So for me, the job creation story really does tie back to, it ties back to the infrastructure investments.
Good point, Mike. So I'm BJ Ducey with Quanta Services. We're one of the largest infrastructure construction companies in North America. Employ about 30,000 employees that are basically in craft labor. So many folks, like you might mention, Mike, who kind of go into this career after high school, then have a long career. And so one of these things with these infrastructure projects that I think people might get lost on is that, in some of the discussions today or in other stuff you hear about these, large infrastructure projects, they talk about there might be only a few jobs or the job picture around those, but you realize that these are, the electricians that go into them, or the welders that go into them, these are careers that people have, and so we do need a big backlog of infrastructure projects for people to have those careers. And so like Mike Skelly mentioned in his presentation, he talked about the CREZ work in Texas, which was a $7 billion investment in our electric transmission projects, or electric transmission infrastructure. And so we had the benefits of what went on during CREZ, the jobs that was created, and now all the, when that was justified, we've had a lot of unintended consequences too that have been very beneficial to the state that are kind of hard to quantify. So the importance of these kind of no regret investments. An example of that is what we're seeing in the Permian Basin now in Texas, in the electrification we can have out there, and then that's supporting the oil and gas infrastructure that's being built there now. When they justified the CREZ and made that investment, the state legislator, they had no knowledge that that was going to be one of the benefits. And so if we hadn't have done that, the Permian Basin wouldn't be developing and providing the jobs and the careers out there that it currently has. So, and I think, Brian has talked about, I think there's a linkage between Quanta and your type of company, because we're building a lot of the infrastructure and installing a lot of the transformers that you're manufacturing. So I think that's another good point is when you look at the whole supply chain in America, these are great paying careers that support a lot of the families. Mike, you mentioned too, my family came out of the agriculture industry and had a great, career and successful and all that good stuff that wouldn't have happened without the type of jobs and economy that we're talked about. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting thinking about the transformer side on power distribution. So I mentioned that we've got all this infrastructure, utility infrastructure on the site. So we have a utility crew of about 15 guys. The average age is in the high 50s. It's a real problem for us. They're great guys, but they're all going to retire soon, and there is no bench. There's just nobody coming up in the pipeline. And some of these guys are electricians. Some of these guys are high voltage electricians. They're linemen. They're guys that work on high-speed relays. And it's just a very small community of those people out there, and there aren't a lot of young people going into it. So, these are the kind of things that we wrestle with. Like, if we're going to own all this utility infrastructure and we're going to maintain it, it's not just dollars. Like, we got to have the people to do the work. And as it exists today, we just don't see that there's a clear pipeline to identify those people, get them into the right job training programs, and make them available. And all this cool stuff we do, building data centers and things, like the power's got to come from somewhere, and somebody's got to make them all work. So these are essential jobs for the economy.
No, you're right, Mike. I think one of the things that this industry can do better with projects like this is, Quanta Services recently built a large training center in LaGrange, Texas, for the same thing you just mentioned, high speed, with electrical infrastructure. We built about a mile and a half long high voltage transmission line, substation, to do all the testing, because you just don't have enough folks entering the skill for, or enough pipeline for what we need as a company to supply ourselves. And additionally, you see, one thing this industry is doing and can do with these infrastructure projects is, I think I've seen some studies where the energy industry is hiring about 50% on average greater than other industries for veterans. And so there's a lot of good things that are going on that can continue to go on with the right amount of infrastructure projects happening. Any questions?
Questions?
Right. Thoughts?
I've got a question.
Sure.
On your Spirit Point project, I think you heard Terry's, the Autodesk presentation on computerized, digitized project analysis and environmental assessment. Do you see any application of that to your project?
So I was not here for Terry's presentation. I was on another panel. The short answer is yes. I mean, like, you know, a project of our magnitude, managing overhead's pretty important, and we've really had to think about how to use technology to make ourselves more efficient. You know, in terms of everything from project management to GIS and not having a bunch of disparate systems that don't talk to one another and aren't integrated. And so we've really had to think hard about how to use technology to keep the team streamlined.
It just seems like that's, if it does what he says it does, it sounds like it might be a magic bullet to answer a lot of questions like transportation and training and all of those things you laid out there. But
on a project like ours needs magic bullets. So if any of you have them, see me afterwards.
good deal, thanks.
I have a question. Don't know the electricity industry. Obviously, you're manufacturing transformers. I know in the rail industry, one of the reasons the U.S. is not competitive in passenger rail is because we use different standards. And I would presume part of your market for transformers, you would still want to sell to external markets, or is there enough demand in the U.S. and are there global standards so that you can sell regardless of where?
Yeah, the answer is that there are global standards. So, you know, large power transformer is virtually the same regardless of where you are in the world. So it really gets down to quality workmanship. And then the issue really from the export standpoint, you know, really are trade restrictions as we go in other countries and buying preferences. So we just see, you know, a much different market as we try to look to export versus kind of what we've seen in the U.S., you know, from the import standpoint.
Anything next?
Anything else?
Hearing none, I guess we're adjourned.
Oops, I got one.
Our country standard not use matrix system. The rest of the world use matrix system. So this is another issue for sending our products abroad because it's different system. Yeah. In terms of metrics, even the rail between, you know, it's a metric rail and the U.S. by inches, or not exactly the same. Yeah, including right now we buy gasoline on gallons, not in liters. Right. Yeah. So is any sense that you do anything in the future for that?
I mean, from our aspect, as I look at our transformer plants, I actually have one plant that works totally in metric, which is the Waukesha facility, and that's really due to the fact that it was actually originally built by ASEA, so it was a European facility on its initiation. And then I've got a facility in Goldsboro that uses imperial or English units. So I do have some differences within the plant, but you know, we use metric exclusively on the vast majority of the products that we have today. So.
And then my company, Quanta, we're involved internationally, Europe, Asia, Australia, Latin America, South America, and I mean, it's, you know, standards-wise, work practices-wise, really kind of comes down to employee safety and standards, and it's very adaptable.
Well, and you know, all of the CAD/CAM systems today, basically you can change, you know, measurement systems and anything just back and forth quite rapidly. So.
Good.
Any other questions? One of the, I mean, it's really interesting for me to listen to you guys because, I mean, you guys are sort of at the core of everything that we're trying to do. And, you know, trying to figure out how to get your voices to rise as high as possible is, to me, the fundamental piece of this. What's the one thing that, you know, we can do to, let's say a group like this can do to be as useful as possible to you guys, just to try to get a sense if you guys could go around the table quickly, because, you know, TradePoint Atlantic is a tremendous job creator and a tremendous catalyst for manufacturing as far as we can tell. You know, talking to Skelly about what he's doing, if you look at you and I talked about that, the potential for transformer sales in the country is incredible. And then you guys are almost two peas in a pod, right? Because somebody's got to string all that line or lay all that pipe, and that's what you guys are doing. So, you know, if you guys had to have, if it were a silver bullet, part of what I'm getting at is we've been listening, you know, a while, and specific projects, but still a while, right? Like you guys have the tunnel project just outside of Trade Point Atlantic. And we had the folks come in last night, and they're very passionate about what they're doing. They're working incredibly hard. How would you I guess the question is, how would you focus them? How would you get them focused on the issues that are really going to make a difference for you guys? So you've got a project, you got a manufactured product, and you've got a tremendous service.
I'd say from our standpoint, we've got a couple of things. First of all, we do have a dumping situation going on with South Korea, as we've seen, you know, really the import duties get lessened over the last 4 years. I was encouraged to see that Hyundai finally did get assessed a 60% import duty due to their, you know, non-willingness to disclose the information requested by the U.S. government. So that's one, because we're suffering a lot of damage, specifically in the western states, by basically the South Koreans dumping. We are at a disadvantage, the Europeans, just due to the strength of the currency in general. But probably the other thing that would help us is that there's been exceptions given to the Buy American clauses, again, with the federally funded agencies. And so it's an awareness of there is a Buy American alternative in large power transformers that didn't exist for a period of years, but has been there for 5 to 6 years. And we're seeing very few, if any, American-built transformers being purchased by the federal agencies today. So those two areas are probably the quickest impact for us to create jobs in our industry.
Well, those are big areas, but did the president's executive order last week, did that start to, I mean, that was in Wisconsin, that started to address your issue?
Yes, it did.
And who else is in sort of your manufacturing bucket? I mean, who else is someone who is in the same kind of position that you're in?
So as we look at it, kind of the key competitors we have in North America are, you know, ABB.
Oh, no, not that. That's not my question. My question is, who else do you know who could create jobs, not transformer jobs, just similar jobs?
From the Buy American piece?
Yeah.
Just a ton of industries. I mean, you got to think, you know, I'm a long-term manufacturing person, worked for GE and Emerson Electric, you know, for most of my career, and just watching the flight of the manufacturing jobs. I mean, manufacturing base used to be, you know, 15 to 18% of our economy, and now it's less than 10% at this point. So in manufacturing, it's great paying jobs, great skilled jobs, and you can support great families on that.
So if you got up and running, and like we talked about, if you doubled your shifts, how many people would you be employing?
If we doubled just the large power piece that we have today, we would add, you know, 200 to 400 employees fairly quickly.
Okay. And then you're talking about at Trade Point Atlantic, 22,000 employees. Or how are you thinking about that?
Well, right. So it's 22,000 across direct, indirect, and induced. Maybe even more than that. I mean, it's a huge opportunity. I have to tell you, when I think about the priority, my biggest challenge is the regulatory burden. And I mean, people talk about that in kind of a generic sense, but in my case, I have 2 environmental regulators that often duplicate efforts. Maryland Department of the Environment, I can tell you, is doing a bang-up job protecting the environment. Having the EPA duplicating all that work isn't helping anybody. We run a railroad that its operations are, depending on how you want to think about it, regulated by a minimum of 3 different agencies. And then we have a marine terminal that has similar level of regulation. When we get to the process of actually building the buildings that are going to employ the people and make the products that are going to be sold here, the timeline to get through the county level, your basic county level stormwater and building permits, state level critical area commission, and then all of the hoops we have to jump through on the environmental side at the federal level, really creates a speed to market problem for us. And so it's great to talk about 22,000 jobs, but like there's unemployed people in Baltimore today who need to get to work. And and we have prospective customers that come to us, and they're ready to build a facility today. And we can tell a great story about how, like, we've got a pathway to get to an environmental solution. We can build their facility for them on a former steel mill site. We've proven the concept. But then when they say, well, when will it be done? The answer is often too long and not certain enough for them.
Right. Yeah, that's the big deal, especially the uncertainty part, right?
Right.
And BJ, how would you answer that question? Because you guys have a gazillion projects that if they'd move through the permitting process more rapidly, how many, I mean, it's crazy how many, you guys just paid what, $30 million for a training facility?
True. So, I mean, it's a similar story, I think, to Mike, too, though, that you know, we recently had one of our large pipeline projects delayed because of stuff going on here in D.C. with FERC and just not being able to get the approvals in time. So it's extremely frustrating for us and our employees, and you know, those employees then will get moved to other projects or potentially laid off. So there's, I would say, for us, 30,000 employees. We're growing at 10% a year, so there's thousands of jobs out there that are potential with the project approvals that are needed at the federal level. Yeah, what I would ask for, I guess, is you know, a tactical thing is just getting FERC back up and running so that we can get these pipeline projects and electrical projects approved that are needed for the interstate projects. And those will, I think, unlock a few good projects.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I just had a comment. It was mostly for Mike. In the 70s, I was editor of a magazine called Steel Magazine.
What, when you were like 12 years old? And
Not really. Yeah, in the 70s, I was editor of a magazine called Steel Magazine, and I sat in on hearings just a few blocks from here and listened to economist after economist tell the industry that we really didn't need. It was a globalization era. We didn't really need a steel industry in the United States. I used to go to Sparrows Point all the time, loved going up there. It was an amazing facility. A lot of my friends worked there. I grew up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. A lot of my friends worked for the steel industry there. Don't always believe what economists try to get you to believe. I mean, they said we could rely on Japan, Germany, China, and you know, guess where we are today.
Well, right. I mean, that's a great point. I mean, and I actually think that the steel industry is pretty instructive in that regard, because in the 70s that was the conventional wisdom that just, you know, steel was going to be made in Japan, China, Turkey, India, wherever, and America couldn't compete. And I think you look at a company like Nucor, that as they have figured out how to do it. It was a different model. They needed to build a smaller facility, a different facility. They needed to put in place a different compensation and incentive structure that allowed them to have a fully open shop workforce. You know, what I think we need to think about sometimes is just, do we need to do it differently? Like, you don't build steel mills on 3,100 acres. You build them on 20 acres now. And they're electric arc furnaces, and, you know, and they're much more efficient. And credit to Nucor for building those facilities in places where people do need jobs. So I take your point, and I agree. Like, we've got to not let that kind of bad news talk us out of doing the right thing.
I think looking back at it, I think what the economists missed was that what these other countries were doing were just exporting unemployment. Yep. I mean, keeping your people employed is so critical today.
Yes.
Just in terms of, because I mean, that's a fantastic, obviously, an observation. Okay, well, thank you very much, you guys. That was great.